If you're a metalhead like me, then you know there's one amplifier that has been the staple of heavy metal music for, no, not you guys. We'll get to you later. Of course, I'm talking about the Marshall JCM800, an amplifier you've heard all over music, like music period, not just metal. However, we're gonna be talking about its history in metal specifically, but I mean, let's just take a second to appreciate that the JCM800 is such a goddamn versatile amplifier that it's been used from guitar players from Jeff Beck to Kerry King, from blues to black metal. This amp really does it all. But if you plug into one thinking you're gonna get immediate Alice in Chains, you might be a little bit disappointed. What? So that's what we're gonna do today. We're gonna talk about this amp's history, what makes it great, find out if the reissues are different than the originals and by how much, and see if we can unlock some of the secrets of all these tones from different eras of metal majesty. So you guys get the idea. Today we're going to explore all things JCM800, where it came from, how different metal acts used it, as well as diving in to see if we can get our own deeply nostalgic tones from it. But before we do any of that, I need to tell you, not only because the law requires me to, but because I have a conscience, this video is brought to you by Sweetwater and Marshall, who gifted me this reissued JCM800 at my request so that I can make this video. No one's paying me, I don't have any ulterior motives, I just want to talk about an amp that I think rules. But if you happen to be planning on buying any gear, and I mean, look at you. You know who you are, then you can use the link down in the description. It greatly helps this channel at no additional cost to you. It's awesome. The JCM800 was unleashed upon the world in 1981. It takes its name from the license plate of Marshall founder Jim Charles Marshall. I think it's important to talk about the predecessors to the JCM800 for context. In the early days of Marshall, the goal was to make an amplifier that could amplify a guitar loud enough to fill medium and moderate sized venues full of screaming teenagers. At the time, PA systems weren't sophisticated enough to run an entire band, and the challenge was always to be heard over the drummer, something I'm sure at least some of you relate to. By the time the 1959 𝗦ci circuit was in production, guitar players had found all sorts of ways to experiment with their amplifiers and their sound, including people like Jimi Hendrix, famously daisy-chaining them together to achieve more saturation and distortion. But distortion came at the cost of your and your audience's ears, since it was often the power tubes that were distorting at or near completely maxed out volumes. This led to the breakthrough of the master volume control and the JMP2203 circuit in the 70s. Marshall themselves, as well as other amp technicians, had been doing these master volume mods to amplifiers, but it was time to put it into production and give guitar players a way to get that sweet, sweet distortion without having to blow up their ear holes. The master volume control allowed guitar players to crank their preamp volume and get the distortion from the preamp tubes, then attenuate the volume back down with the master volume knob. This resulted in a slightly different but still satisfactory saturation that completely reshaped guitar tones in the 70s. Now, in terms of the circuits between the JCM800 and the JMP, they are both 2203 circuits. However, many note that the JCM800 was a more refined circuit with a tighter response and better clarity. There were tweaks to the circuit, including a reduced B+ voltage, but I'm not really the guy to explain electronic schematics to you in detail, so I'll leave that up to dudes like Jason at Head First if you want to deep dive into that. Another important factor that we need to discuss leading up to the 800 is the fact that many people were not only having their amps modded with the master volume mod, but clipping mods as well. These are essentially, in most cases, extra gain stages added to the preamp section of the amplifier, some tube and some solid state diodes, or both. But by the 80s, pedals had become an increasingly popular way to get a similar effect by running them in front of an amplifier and boosting it. While most people in the mod community will tell you that running a pedal is quite a bit different and the mod feels more inherently a part of the amplifier itself, the benefit of using a pedal to boost your amplifier is that you can use different combinations and get different flavors of clipping, compression, and saturation. The JCM800 was also the perfect type of amplifier for this since, like I mentioned before, it had a more refined and tighter sound, allowing it to be used with a wider range of pedals while retaining its shape and tone before becoming fuzzy and flabby sounding. Now, it's hard to pinpoint exactly where the idea of boosting an amp came from, but the reference I always think of is Randy Rhoads. With his heavily modified JMP era 𝗦ci and his Distortion Plus. I did a video on the Blizzard of Oz tone a while back. It was a lot of fun. If you haven't seen it, you should check it out. You know, I gotta be honest with you though. Something about this tone is just off. Hold on one second. Is this joke doing anything for you? Was this joke worth it? But when we get into the 80s and the JCM800, boosting was way more common. Bands like Metallica and Slayer are often mentioned in this conversation for pioneering using an Ibanez TS9 Tubescreamer in the front. Zakk Wylde famously used his SD1 to boost his Marshall, and later bands like Extreme and death metal bands like 𝗦ici𝗰𝗶𝗹 would boost them with the Rat. And I did hint at black metal earlier, so I want to go a little bit outside the norm and mention it. Really all of black metal, especially in its early formative years with the HM2. I realize many of you are probably wondering why I'm not talking about bands like Entombed and the Swedish Chainsaw Sound with the HM2. To be honest, honest with you, I think that topic's just been covered to death. So when I was looking into bands that were using the HM2 and I came across black metal bands, I just thought that was more interesting. We will do some chainsaw tones, but yeah, that's why I did that. While that might not be peak guitar tone on anyone's list, I do think it's worth exploring because it's a completely different sound and texture than the others. So I have a few different boosts here so we can explore some of the different flavors, but I also have two JCM800s. One is an original from 1987 and the other is one of the current generation of reissues. I do want to compare them and see how close the reissues are to the original circuit, as well as try some different flavors of boost and see if we can get some of that nostalgic goodness out of it. All right, let's go plug in and chug out. Howdy, fellas, ladies. We're plugged into this Marshall JCM800. I have a lot of stuff to get through in this video today, so, you know, forgive me if I'm being brief on certain things. I'm gonna talk about the signal chain right now. I'm using this Epiphone Les Paul Custom, inspired by Gibson. Les Paul Custom, the one with a long name. That is going into the Marshall JCM800. Now, this is a 2204, but it is an original 2204. I want to play through this first, and then we're going to go to the new reissue, and, you know, just see if we can observe any sort of change. Like, if I can observe any sort of changes, maybe you'll hear them on your end too. They're not exactly the same amps. The reissue that I have is a 2203 100-watt. There are differences. However, we will test this with a lower master volume to get more of like a fair comparison, since we won't be pushing the power section so much. And then I do want to, you know, push the power section a little bit and see if we can get some of that, you know, out of the amplifier. That is going through the Boss Waza tube amp expander. Like I said, I want to push the power section, so this is an absolute necessary piece of equipment to be able to do that without just damaging my hearing. That is going into this Bogner cabinet. You might be asking yourself, why a Bogner cabinet? What is going on here, man? That is weird and out of context. It is. Let me explain. The reason I'm using this Bogner cabinet is because it has two different speakers in it. It has a T75 and it has a Vintage 30. Both would be common in, you know, the traditional Marshall 1960 cabinets. However, we will run a line out of this as well, and that way I can throw like an IR, like a Marshall Greenback cab IR when necessary. Whatever you were listening to will be listed on the bottom of the screen for your own information. Okay, let's quit the yapping and plug in, right? It's just instant rock and roll right away. Now we are going to be changing up the guitars in this video as well. I do want to go to an EMG guitar. One of the reasons people really liked EMGs and they started to gain so much popularity is because they would push these amps. Like, everyone was just trying to get more distortion back in the day. They just wanted more gain, essentially. And EMGs would help you achieve that. However, you know, we're going to start here and just compare the differences in between the 50 watt and the 2203 for some context before we get into the 2203 and all the different boost flavors. Okay? This is pretty like classic rock and roll, man. I do have actually the master volume pretty loud. Let's turn this down. That way we have a little bit more fair comparison between this older 2204 and the newer reissued 2203. Now, if you wanted to, we could go into the low input and you just get a more cleaned up sound. You know, this is before channel switching was really a thing, but essentially the low sensitivity input is kind of like a different channel. We're not doing that though. You know what we're here for. Yeah, it's a vibe, man. It's an 80s cigarette smoke-filled club vibe, but it's definitely a vibe. It's almost like for guitars that are tuned to E standard, the tone stack on a JCM800 adjusts the frequencies that sit perfectly in a mix. And that's probably why they land on so many records, is because they just sound great on their own, you know? But let's do one last thing here with the 50 watt. We're gonna turn up, I gotta turn this down first. We're gonna turn up the master volume quite a bit. And we obviously get more distortion. It's not like a cutting, biting sort of distortion like you will get by boosting the front of the amplifier, making the amp distort with the power tubes in this way. It gives you more like flub, almost, I would say. It's, you know, it's definitely not tight. And obviously we could turn the bass down to compensate for that. You know, it's not really made for that kind of music though. It's just more like... It's made for that kind of music. You know, this is an amplifier that was made in conjunction with the music that was popular in that era, and that being the blossoming hard rock, or even what we would call, you know, classic rock now scene. So, you know, that's what I think of when I think of this amp. And then, you know, people started modding them and doing other things to them, boosting them to really get, you know, metal tones out of them, which we're gonna do here. Let's switch over to the 100 watt amp and we can start doing metal stuff. Okay, we're back with the 100 watt amplifier. Something you might be immediately noticing right now is it's dead quiet. That's because this 100 watt reissue actually has an effects loop in it. So, nice thing about that is I can put a noise gate in the loop and then it's quiet right now. Like, it's just, there's no sound. It's really nice. But if I'm being 100% honest with you, there is a little bit of like that. It's like this jangly magic in the top end. You quote that, put it on a t-shirt. The jangly magic in the top end. It's a little bit different, like this is a little bit flatter. Now take that with a massive grain of salt. One of the things I didn't mention about that 50 watt Marshall is that thing has been serviced and it has been optimized, I guess. That 50 watt Marshall is as stock as possible. Everything that has been replaced in that amplifier has been replaced with the proper components. And one of the things that the owner of that amplifier told me that he really believes in is like, that's how you make those amps sound good. You know, the more you modify them, the more they kind of lose their specialness. I don't know if that's necessarily my opinion or not. Maybe that's your opinion. You're more than welcome to let me know your opinion in the comments, but that's just what he told me. And I do happen to trust the guy. I think he knows what he's talking about. So. You know, one of the things I do prefer about the 50 watt though is I like the knobs better. I like the vintage style knobs with the little pointers on them. I think those are really cool. They're also hard to find. I wanted to replace the knobs on this one with them and they're just very expensive. So I don't know if I'll ever do that. Let's push the power section here and see if we get a similar thing. I'm guessing we're gonna have to push this quite a bit harder. Yeah, it definitely has that thing happening despite having what you would assume would be much more headroom. Okay, so we all understand a stock JCM800 at this point, right? I think we've sort of established the baseline here. Let's switch guitars and see how much difference an active pickup makes. Definitely something different happening in the top end. It's like maybe a little bit more, I always describe it as splatty, you know, but it's like there's something happening in the top end with active pickups. Take into consideration also, this guitar is tuned to C standard instead of E standard like the guitar I was just playing. You know, these are all just like little variations of things, but I think you get the idea. Another thing about these amplifiers on their own without any pedals, which I think is part of the reason that they take a boost pedal really well, is they're very dynamic. At the risk of sounding totally tacky, it just gives you more freedom to express yourself, which, you know, sounds like a boomer thing to say, but it's definitely true. There's just quite a bit of dynamic range for you to really lighten up and get a different sound and then hit really hard and get a completely different sound out of the amp. Let's put something in front of this. First overdrive we're gonna try out is the Ibanez TS9. This is a super common pedal used to boost amplifiers. It has soft, symmetrical diode clipping and really pushes mid-range, making it cut through a mix. It was released sometime around 1982 and made famous and used by guitar players like The Edge and James Hetfield in Metallica. I mean, just everybody. This is a super, super common pedal for boosting amplifiers. You know, it does a thing. Here's off. Now, one of the things I've always noticed with a Tubescreamer and a JCM800 is a Tubescreamer inherently sort of has this mid-focus. And with the Marshall already having like a really emphasized mid-range, that could or could not be desirable for you. And we can also add more low end too. When we use a boost, it definitely cuts the low end. And now you see why people are boosting these amplifiers, dude. They just sound really, really awesome. And it's just such a mainstay because of that. There have been many amplifiers that have replicated what the JCM800 did. It definitely was a pioneer in its own right, and it definitely deserves its place in history for that. And if you wanted more saturation than that, you know, you can always turn the gain up. I have the gain at 0 right now. We can rock it something like that. Really just makes this amp roar. If you want something beyond, you know, just your stock rock and roll tone, I think that this is such a good base for adding pedals to. This is not news to anyone. I'm not saying anything profound here. Let's go with another overdrive. This is the Boss SD1, made famous by guitar players like Zakk Wylde. Now, while this overdrive does have some similarities to the Tubescreamer that we just checked out, it does feature different clipping. This has asymmetrical clipping versus symmetrical clipping, and while it will still give you a nice mid boost just like the Tubescreamer, the texture of the distortion is just quite a bit different. I would refer to this as more gritty, whereas the TS9 is a little bit more biting, but we'll get into that here when we demo it. It was released sometime in 1981, which was right around the same time as the JCM800. And you know, I do have the tone all the way up here. Let's actually go with the tone in more of a neutral position. But we're still achieving the same thing of like adding saturation in, tightening things up so we can get those chugs, you know? What came first, the chicken or the egg in this case? I'm not really sure, but you could tell a lot of this music that was coming out just required a tight low end to get those like palm mutes and to be really fast, especially those early thrash bands, you know, there's a lot of... And without this pedal, it's just not nearly as tight. It doesn't have the same effect, you know? And we could obviously add the gain character from the pedal in here as well. I'm gonna dial the tone back here just a little bit preemptively. It's really cool. It does, you know, metal. I think with this, the saturation character that you get is quite a bit different as well. I would describe this pedal as more chaotic, I guess, in its grain, like the texture of the grain, the saturation, where something like the Tubescreamer is a little bit more controlled and like scalpel, like, I guess. That's why I like the Tubescreamer a little bit more personally, but you know, these are all just different flavors, you know? This is like a pick your poison sort of thing. Choose your own adventure, whatever. However you want to look at it. There's so many different cool options that you can get because there's just a plethora of different pedals out there. Let's switch to another one, speaking of. This is an Ibanez Tube King pedal. The one that we have here is one of the reissues that came out in the 2000s. This differs from the original that was released in the 90s. The 90s version used a star plate voltage circuitry. However, the re-release uses a high voltage plate circuitry, so we are fully powering this 12AX7. And in the context of this video, something that came out in the late 70s, like a BK Butler hand-built tube driver, would have been a little bit more appropriate. This is just what I had, so this is what we're gonna use. This is the Ibanez Tube King. Now, I'm just gonna guess here, if one of the reasons that people were using overdrives in front of amplifiers to boost them was sort of parallel what was going on in the modding community with these amplifiers, then tube-based distortion pedals were probably in line with that as well. I don't think it's that far-fetched to assume that if tube gain stages were being added to these amplifiers to get extra saturation or gain out of them, that that would increase the demand for tube-based distortion pedals, if you follow me. This is just a personal theory with zero research, so take it for what it's worth, but you know, it wouldn't surprise me. Now, the thing about using a tube-based distortion pedal is the distortion character, like the saturation, sounds warmer. You know, it sounds a little bit more, I don't know, organic, I guess, if you want to use that terminology, but it sounds warmer. And the trade-off with that is, if we're comparing this Ibanez pedal to the other one, the Tubescreamer, you know, the Tubescreamer gives you like precision. It gives you scalpel-like precision and just really tightens up your chugs, your palm mutes. And this does it as well, just not to the same effect. So, you know, the trade-off to me is like a little bit warmer, more growly sort of sound versus not having that attack in your chugs. But it definitely sounds really cool, and it's a totally different vibe than using something with like diode clipping, you know. You have a tube in here. It's like a high-powered tube. The other really nice thing about the Tube King pedal is it has a built-in gate. My volume is up and I'm dead quiet right now. And it cuts right there. I feel like pedals with built-in noise gates are super overpowered, you know? Leads me to the next one. Originally, that segue was supposed to lead into the section of the video where I show the devil from my company, 𝗦cie Audio, boosting the JCM800, but I realized while I was editing, it sort of changed the tone and made it feel like more of a commercial, and that's not what I was going for here. So I'm going to take this section and put it over on the 𝗦cie Audio channel where it feels a little bit more appropriate. I will leave a link for that down in the description if you are interested, but for now, we're just gonna move on to the next pedal in the list. Okay, the next pedal that we're going to use to boost this amplifier is the Ritual by my homie Daniel over at Lichtlaerm Audio. The reason that I'm using this pedal is because I don't own a ProCo Rat, which would have been a really popular boost, especially like in the early death metal scene. Now, the difference in between the Ritual and the original Rat is the Ritual essentially has a bunch of different modes and it has a built-in boost. We're not going to use that. The modes cover the 3 most common mods to the original Rat circuit. The original Rat circuit used 2 silicone diodes in reverse parallel for hard clipping. Common mods were things like the Turbo Rat, which added a switch for red LEDs, providing brighter, fuzzier, more compressed sound, and the Dirty Rat, which used germanium diodes, which would make it even fuzzier sounding. Now, quick disclaimer, while I shot this portion of the video, I was actually using it in Turbo Rat mode, but I think you will get the idea. The Rat is just a little bit more fuzzy and unruly than the SD1. Okay, I don't own a Rat pedal, which would have been really popular with these amplifiers, especially in death metal circles, you know, like we talked about 𝗦cie, stuff like that. I do, however, own the Ritual by Lichtlaerm Audio, which is a Rat on steroids, essentially. This pedal has a boost built in. We're not using that. We're just using the Rat circuit, and I'm being pretty aggressive with it. I can probably dial this back here a little bit. You know, I've always viewed using a Rat as a boost to be a little bit more in line with like a fuzz pedal and less in line with an overdrive. That's probably emphasized with this pedal quite a bit, but that character might have been more desirable at that time instead of like a cutting scalpel-like character like you would want for thrash metal with the chuggies. Something like this for a little bit more brutal death metal. And while it definitely has more of a fuzz character, it is not by any stretch of the imagination the fuzziest on this list. So let's get into that one next. Okay, the last pedal on this list is the mighty Boss HM2. While using this in context to get a Swedish chainsaw sound from bands like Entombed, I just thought it would be a little bit more interesting to explore its application in a genre like black metal. Don't worry, I have a tone quest coming very soon and we will do chainsaw tones, but for this one, I wanted to focus more on the black metal stuff. We will do just a scotch of chainsaw though. The original HM2 was released in October of 1983, which makes a lot of sense since it's orange and black, you know, Halloween. And the HM2 is really unique. It uses a mix of op amps for soft clipping and silicone diodes for hard clipping. This is what creates that chainsaw sort of sound, but really what we're talking about is essentially a fuzz pedal, like a really blown out fuzz pedal. But you know, that uniqueness is why people love this thing so much. I think it's worth mentioning it too, that when Boss released this product, it really wasn't a success and they ended up discontinuing it. And it was in the underground metal scenes where this pedal found popularity and eventually led to a bunch of smaller manufacturers releasing a bunch of variations of this HM2 pedal. My favorite is the 𝗦cie by Lichtlaerm Audio, but we're gonna use a 𝗦ci HM2 in this portion of the video. Okay, this is a Boss HM2 pedal that needs no introduction here, right? Like chainsaw tones. But you know, a lot of early black metal bands were using the HM2 like through these type of amplifiers, maybe JCM800s, maybe PVs, probably just whatever was readily available at the time. But you know, the whole idea with black metal tone is not getting a good guitar tone per se, not something that's pleasable to your ear. Like the whole point of the sound of black metal was to keep posers out. You know, that's what they wanted. They didn't want posers listening to their music. They were trying to achieve something like an atmosphere that was quite a bit different in music at the time, especially metal. Metal had gone towards more production heavy, things sounding, you know, tighter, clickier, a lot of the reason people were boosting amplifiers in the first place. Black metal was trying to not do that. Black metal was almost trying to do the opposite. Whether or not you agree with that, you know, that's up to you, but that's kind of what was going on there. So. You can see I have this thing dialed. That's how HM2 purists say that you have to have it dialed in. I don't necessarily agree with that, but I just wanted to do that for demonstrative purposes. You have to kill the bass on the JCM800 though, or it just sounds blown out. Like you can't even hear the note choices, which might have been, you know, fine for black metal, I guess. Let's try and get something a little bit more usable and less, I mean, it's still noisy, but maybe a little bit less noisy. Let's try. Again, I think the whole point of early black metal was not having great tone. It was actually kind of the opposite. Truth be told, I've never been a huge fan of the HM2 thing, but you know, it's a thing. Note definition and clarity is definitely not a priority if you're using an HM2, but you know, I just thought it was an interesting sort of side quest on this journey of JCM800 tone lore. So that's why I did it. All right, shout out to 𝗦cie and Marshall for making this happen. More importantly, shout out to you guys for being here with me. I'm really interested. Do you guys agree with me on my assessment of the JCM800 and you know, its history in rock and roll and metal? You know, let me know down in the comments below. Of course, if you like this video, make sure to do the things so that YouTube knows that you like it. If you really like what I do here on this channel, consider subscribing or being massively overpowered like these beautiful humans over here on Patreon, where you get behind the scenes access. And I will see you in the next video. Bye.